Inheriting billions usually creates a spoiled brat. But what Elon Musk is instilling in his kids isn't just wealth. It's a psychological conditioning so intense it alters how they see human existence. Here is the dark side of growing up Musk. Most wealthy parents don't sit down and consciously decide to raise entitled children. It just happens. Comfort becomes the wallpaper, and kids absorb it, the way they absorb language. You don't teach a child that a private jet is normal. You just take enough private jets. Musk has publicly and repeatedly stated he does not intend to leave his children significant wealth. That's not unusual for a billionaire to say. What's unusual is the specific frame he wraps around it. It's not, "I want you to earn your own way," the standard self-made man speech. It's closer to, "Money is a distraction from the mission." And that is a completely different psychological installation. This is where the concept of scarcity theater comes in. Scarcity theater is the deliberate performance of non-entitlement inside an environment of extreme resource access. It's not genuine scarcity. These children exist inside one of the most resource-rich ecosystems on the planet. But it's not open wealth either, where the kid knows they're rich and simply acts accordingly. It's something stranger than both. Think of it like being handed the keys to a Ferrari and being told the point is to understand the engine, not to drive it. The Ferrari is still there, the keys are still in your hand, but you've been given a completely different story about what this moment means, and that story is going to shape every decision you make about cars for the rest of your life. That's psychologically weirder than poverty and weirder than wealth, because at least those two states have a coherent internal logic. Scarcity theater requires the child to hold two contradictory realities simultaneously. I have access to almost everything, and that access is not the point. That's a cognitive load most adults never have to carry. Now, here's the pattern interrupt. The assumption when you hear Musk isn't raising spoiled kids is that he's running the standard discipline playbook. Chores, structure, accountability, maybe a modest allowance. The actual mechanism he appears to be running is something closer to identity by mission. His children aren't being raised with "you are wealthy" as their central self-story. They're being raised with "you are part of something important." And that is a fundamentally different psychological anchor. Identity by mission does specific things to a developing brain. It recalibrates risk tolerance. If your identity is tied to a purpose larger than yourself, failure on any individual task doesn't threaten who you are, the way it would for a kid whose self-worth is built on status or comfort. It rewires peer relationships. You don't measure yourself against other rich kids because rich kid isn't the frame you've been handed. And it distorts the sense of normal in a very specific direction. Normal stops meaning what most people have and starts meaning what serves the goal. Here's the uncomfortable part of that. Identity by mission, when it works, produces extraordinary focus and resilience. When it doesn't work, it produces something that looks a lot less like a well-adjusted adult and a lot more like a person who was handed a purpose before they were old enough to choose one. The difference between a calling and an assignment is consent, and children don't consent to their psychological architecture. So once you see the mission identity frame clearly, something becomes entirely predictable. These kids are going to seem strange to both normal rich kids and normal non-rich kids. Not because they're damaged and not because they're exceptional, but because they've been optimized for a third category that doesn't have a name yet. And that category gets even more complicated once you factor in the environment they're actually developing inside, which turns out to add a layer of pressure. The mission identity frame alone was never built to absorb. Do you think being raised with "you are part of a mission" is a psychological gift or a burden a kid never asked for? Gift or burden? Pick one and drop your answer in the comments below. Because the mission frame is only half the picture. The environment these kids actually grow up inside adds a pressure the mission alone can't explain. That mission identity frame we just walked through, the one that recalibrates risk tolerance and rewires what normal even means, it holds up reasonably well in a vacuum. The problem is, Musk's children don't live in a vacuum. They live in one of the most publicly observed family situations on Earth, and that changes the math entirely. Here's what breaks the mission identity frame open. You can build a child's sense of self around purpose and still give them a quiet life to develop inside. Most parents who do the "you are part of something bigger" speech do it from a house in the suburbs, where the neighbors don't know their name. The child gets the psychological installation and then gets to go figure out who they are, in relative privacy. Musk's children do not have that second half of the equation. XAE12, legally registered as XAEA12 in California, has appeared alongside Musk at several high-profile public events, becoming a visible presence in Musk's public life. And that's just the most visible example. By 2026, Musk had been reported to have at least 14 children across multiple co-parenting situations, several of which became public through court documents and media reports, rather than Musk's own acknowledgement. A family structure so publicly documented and so genuinely unusual that the children exist inside a media narrative, whether they choose to or not. The sheer scale of that family, spread across different mothers in different households, means there is no unified private container for these kids to develop inside. The story about them is already being written, constantly, by people who have never met them. Psychologists use the term audience self to describe the version of yourself you perform when you know you're being watched, and they use it to explain why people behave differently at job interviews than at home. It's a real cognitive mode, and it costs something to maintain. For most people, it's occasional. You switch it on for the presentation, you switch it off at dinner. For Musk's children, the audience is close to permanent. Not because cameras are in their bedroom, but because their existence is a public narrative. And a child who grows up knowing that develops a relationship with their own identity that is fundamentally different from a child who doesn't. That's not a metaphor, that's a different cognitive task. Here's where it gets genuinely absurd. A normal wealthy kid worries about being photographed at the wrong party. That's the level of public scrutiny most rich kids' psychology is built around. Musk's children are developing a self while being the children of arguably one of the most publicly discussed people on Earth. A man who runs companies that reshape entire industries, who held a formal government role as a special government employee advising the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, whose name appears in the news cycle essentially every day. The psychological gap between famous rich kid and child of the most talked about person alive is not a gap, it is a canyon. Now, fold the Scarcity Theater back in, because this is where it gets strange in a very specific way. At home, the message is, money isn't the point, mission is the point. Outside the home, in every external context, every article, every comment section, every conversation a stranger has about their father, these children are defined almost entirely by wealth and power. They are simultaneously being told the money doesn't matter and being introduced to the world as the heirs to one of the largest fortunes in human history. That is a psychological split with no comfortable middle position. It tends to produce one of two outcomes. Either the internal frame wins, the mission identity holds, and the child develops a kind of resilience that is genuinely unusual, or the external narrative wins. The split becomes a fracture, and the child spends years trying to reconcile two completely incompatible stories about who they are. There is no average outcome here. There is no reasonably well-adjusted kid who is also kind of famous. The environment doesn't allow for that. And that's where the two halves of this equation collide into something entirely unprecedented. The reason Musk's children will never act like normal rich kids isn't simply the parenting philosophy, and it isn't simply the public exposure. It's that those two forces are compounding each other inside a family structure with no real historical template. They're not being raised to be rich kids. They're not being raised to be public figures. They're being raised to be something that doesn't have a category yet. And the psychological work of becoming a person without a category to borrow is either the most interesting developmental challenge imaginable or an extraordinarily heavy thing to hand a child before they're old enough to set it down. Subscribe if you want more like this, and watch the next video on screen.